Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, founder of Achievable, and we have affordable ACT and CLT courses that include everything you need to ace your exam. A full textbook, tons of review questions backed by our memory enhancing algorithm, a built-in study planner, videos on key topics, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to save 10%. Now, let's get started. Today we've got Rebecca Stuart-Orlowski with us. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, so you can correct me if you want. And would love to hear a little bit more about you and your background and your company.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler, for having me on. You did well, Rebecca Stuart-Orlowski, and I run Orlowski College Consulting, LLC. I am what we call an independent educational consultant, and that means I help students through the college search and application process. But I also help homeschool parents with course selection and figuring out parent documentation and everything that goes with being a homeschooler. And my background is I was a homeschooler myself for 25 years. I have three sons. The oldest is 31, the youngest is 21. And so that is my background. And I do work with all sorts of students, but my heart is definitely for homeschool students.
That's great. Yeah, well, fantastic. And yeah, really excited to talk to you today as you are kind of the one of the seminal experts on this topic from what I understand, and I'm really excited to cover it, which is how do you apply to college as somebody who is homeschooled? And it's something that I've been wondering about for a while. We haven't had on this show before because really, the college application process, so much of it feels kind of like momentum when you're doing it, going through like a normal high school process. And a lot of that momentum is provided by the school or provided by the fact that your peers are doing these things. Or, if you're a parent, like your child's parents, peers, right? Like the
Yeah.
people who are parents of kids the
Yeah.
same age as you are
Yeah.
going through all this stuff. And so you kind of feel swept up in it and you get on it. But with homeschooling, I think that that's probably not quite the same. Maybe you're in a homeschool group or a co-op, but for a lot of people, I think that you're kind of doing it completely on your own. So, yeah, where do you want to start? I mean, I guess,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
I
what's
would
like the best way to kind of kick this off?
Yeah, I'd love to sort of maybe not dispel myths, but sort of help people broaden their understanding of, what homeschooling can look like. So I am in San Diego, California. I'm sure that your listenership is all over the country. And here in California, there are numerous ways to quote unquote homeschool. But the two ways that are most, I guess, conducive to independent homeschooling, where parents have more control, would be something called the private satellite program, which you have sort of this overarching private school that keeps your records for you, but you're still choosing all your classes, you're still directing your child's education. And then there's the PSA, private school affidavit, where you file your own affidavit to become your own private school. So that's what I did for 22 years. So basically, I was the director of my own homeschool. And contrary maybe to a lot of people's beliefs, most homeschoolers don't stay at home a lot. Like you mentioned, there are co-ops, a lot of homeschoolers in California, maybe in particular, but other places around the country and even the world take community college classes, sometimes four-year college classes. There are a lot of online providers for, things like AP courses, English, math, art of problem solving is a classic provider for, really rigorous math. So most homeschoolers that I interact with sort of do what's called eclectic homeschooling, just a blend of finding whatever works for them. And I'm going to kind of lean in a little bit on just my own personal experience, sort of to help your listeners understand that. So, my eldest son was really, really self-directed. So he loved learning, and it was apparent early on that he loved math. So we just let him fly in math, and later he fell in love with physics, and he always was a really big reader and writer, which, kind of aligns with your CLT testing and the whole, classical school model. And by the way, I work with secular, Christian, students. Some use classical, education, others don't. But so he just was super self-directed. He started community college classes in middle school. and so just as you talk about sort of this, peer group shaping a student toward college, his bent was just naturally geared toward college because he was just an intense learner. So, by the time he was done with high school, he had taken upper college division math and physics classes just because that's where his path led him. So I say homeschooling actually prepares students very well because they have the freedom to really dive deeply into things that matter to them. And then it becomes a matter of being informed, the parents and the students. What does it look like to prepare to go through the college application process? What do we need to know?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Does everyone who homeschools have to register themselves as a school? I just never knew that. Or is it
Oh,
vary by state?
totally, exactly. Great question. It varies by state, and the laws, vary. Like here in California, it's kind of interesting because, while people might think California has one way of doing things, we actually have a lot of freedom when it comes to homeschooling. So as private schools we don't have to follow like what the public school does. So we set our own graduation requirements. Other states will have, you have to have testing, you have to submit your coursework to the government. So it does, Tyler, depend on the state and the regulations. So we actually have a lot of freedom and flexibility here in California, which I think is a great thing.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And I mean, yeah, I think that then we don't need to like dig into too much of like being your own private school, right?
Right.
Um, yeah. So then when you're talking to families about this, like when do you start talking to them? Like at what part of quote unquote high school, I guess,
Yeah.
would you want them to be, maybe would you want them to be talking to you and
Yeah.
starting to think about the college application process and planning it? And what does that timeline look like and kind of what are you doing when?
Yeah, that's excellent. So actually, depending on the student, anytime a student starts taking high school level coursework, and honestly, a lot of people come to homeschooling because their kids are advanced. So they might be taking high school level work in elementary or middle school. So that's when we start talking about documenting, what your student is doing. So when I'm working with parents, there are two separate parts, working with parents and then working with the homeschoolers themselves. But for parents, there's going to be three main documents. There's going to be the transcripts. There's going to be a counselor letter. So parents actually write their child's counselor letter because they are their child's counselor. And then there's going to be a school profile. And the transcripts will also include course descriptions. So I start talking with parents, early on in high school, encouraging them to document, the coursework that we're doing. I, as an IEC who works with homeschoolers, I have sample documents for my families. So I
Hmm.
share sample transcripts, sample counselor letter, sample school profile. And so we use sort of we use some standards. So because if the child is wanting to go to college, we want them to be able to take and be competitive, just like everybody else. So here in California, we have something called A through G. It's just your basic set of, high school requirements. And so we track with that. Yes, you need 4 years of English. Yes, you need at least 3 years of math. Yes, you need US history and world history and so forth and so on. So I'm talking to them early on and we're tracking, those core academic courses to make sure that they've, kind of checked the boxes. And then, we also have a lot of freedom to go beyond those. So that's sort of what it looks like at the beginning. The big question is, do homeschoolers get into college, right? So everybody wants to know, do homeschoolers get into college and what do colleges think? And of course, the big question that was for so many years, and it's maybe not asked as much, what about socialization, right? So those are kind of the big questions that we get asked. And, number one, yes, homeschoolers get into college all the time. My eldest son was fortunate to get into all his schools, and he graduated from MIT in 2016. So he got into Princeton and Penn and MIT and Baylor and lots of schools. And not every homeschooler is looking to apply to selective schools, but certainly colleges are well familiar. And I would say COVID actually sort of expedited the understanding what it means to be a homeschooler. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, a lot of people ended up homeschooling and maybe some went back, but I think that kind of changed the landscape on homeschooling. And then the socialization question, like I said, so many homeschoolers are, if you go out and you're doing, your sport or you're doing chess club or math competitions, it's a good bet there's homeschoolers in those communities as well. So, I don't, there are just like public school students who are really shy and introverted and don't like to be out a lot. There are homeschool students that do that as well. But really, I don't notice a difference, between socialization situations in, I guess the difference would be in public or private school, you're with your same age peers. In homeschooling, you're with a
Mhm.
bunch of different people from, teens to older people, like at community college, right? You're taking class with people who are, getting their second degree, people who are working and coming back, into the school and situation. So yeah, so I think those are kind of non-starter issues as far as like, do they get into college? Yes. Are they socialized? Yes.
Well, yeah, I'd love to like talk also just about the more like, those two things, obviously those are fine. I think that for me, the thing that I was most thinking about when I was thinking about applying for like a homeschool was the transcript and curriculum question, right? I know that like, yes, there's like standardized tests and like, you can take standardized tests to kind of prove your competency generally, though I also feel like there's probably a fair amount of homeschool people that do test optional. So I'm wondering how you can prove to colleges that you can handle a college curriculum.
Right. Well, so before I answer that, I'm sure, Tyler, you know that there is some rampant grade inflation in schools. So,
Oh yeah.
so it's not necessary, and colleges are finding this out, right? There was a, recent report out by UCSD that kids are coming in that, they're not at all prepared for the, any college level math whatsoever. So, if we're going to ask this question, right, it's not just homeschoolers, it's everyone, like what's happening with grades. But as far as validation, like I said, most homeschoolers I work with are taking, college classes. They
Mhm.
can take AP classes and then take AP exams, although it is hard for homeschoolers to procure an AP exam because
Mhm.
those are school-based tests. A lot of
Right.
homeschoolers use accredited resources just because that's, their concern. So there are things like UC
Mhm.
Scout and BYU, ASU Online Universal Learner. Those are all accredited resources. So colleges, not that they would ask, but there's actually a transcript for those. But colleges get homeschoolers. If you're building a good, strong profile, it's okay to have self-directed courses. It's okay to
Mhm.
design your own coursework and go deep because most homeschoolers mix that up with accredited courses. So in the case of my son, a lot of his curriculum was through the community college, through San Diego State, but he also had some self-directed courses. No problem. Nobody questioned it because he had, very strong test scores, right? Very strong SAT, very strong AP exams, great letters of recommendation. There's another way, Tyler, to kind of prove your curriculum, right? When you're
Mhm.
applying to any schools on the Common Application, you're going to get 2 to 3 teacher recommendations. You're going to get 1 to 2 non-academic recommendations. So there are a lot of, in holistic admissions, there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle. And then for colleges that, require or recommend it, there's the interview. And colleges,
Mhm.
oftentimes will, require a homeschool student to interview. And that's another great way for them to show their intellectual prowess. So it all adds up to, being just like anybody else, that homeschool application. And that, like I
Mhm.
said, the curriculum, we make sure that we have, whether it's English provided by, Pennsylvania homeschoolers or the community college, math, art of problem solving, or a private tutor who's taking you through a great textbook. We just, we make sure that that curriculum is as rigorous as the student's college goals, right? If a student is shooting
Right.
high, that curriculum needs to be rigorous. That's all there is to it.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. For me, it's more about like how do you communicate that to the college and how do you also potentially apply it to like earn college credits, right? Like especially if AP exams are hard.
Right.
Like
I
how do you
mean,
kind of prove the veracity of your curriculum, I guess?
right. So proving the veracity of the curriculum. So, like I said, parents, write that counselor letter. That's for schools on the Common Application. So they're going to see a school profile. So the schools are going to be
Hmm.
able to see exactly who those providers were, how the student was learning, what style of homeschooling. And I I think we're kind of proving the veracity, as we have seen, it's not necessarily like a kid can come from any, high school and it looks like
Hmm.
they've proved the veracity, but then they get to, college and they struggle because the teachers have been just moving them through and giving them A's. So I don't think homeschoolers have any higher level of onus on them to prove the veracity of what they're doing.
Hmm.
But through counselor letter, through school profile, through community college transcripts, through,
Hmm.
accredited transcripts, just through test scores. Tests are a great way. Tests are a fantastic way. And quite frankly, right, I sit in California and the lawsuit has expired on, the UCs have been test blind, and that started 5 years ago in COVID, and that's expired. And I'm hearing grumblings about bringing back the test in the UC system. So what we're finding is like professors are like, yeah, we need kids to come in, ready, and a test is a good way to figure that out. And so, yeah, homeschool. Yeah, some do apply test optional, but the majority of my homeschoolers are taking that test. And SAT is accessible to everyone, SAT, ACT, and CLT. They're all available. Yeah.
Hmm.
And in fact, right, the CLT
Great.
is even more, it's easier to access than, than other tests. So it's a great alternative.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. I think also I'd love to kind of think about like what colleges are looking for when you're coming from a homeschool environment, right? And I mean, we've talked about the transcript a bit at this point, but I also want to kind of cover the other things too, because you're not going to be president of the chess club when you are the only person in it, right? So, like, how do colleges look at what you're doing, and also what opportunities do homeschools have, let's say, that other people might not have?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So if we're talking about like activities, yes, you're not going to be the president of your, class, but, you mentioned chess. So I'll use my son as an example. He was involved in the San Diego Chess Club and he did a lot of tournaments and, some of his closest friends, they formed a chess team and they were like number one in the US, chess younger group or whatever. So I mean, of course, he had friends from different high schools throughout the region. So he didn't need to be president of the chess club to prove he was the captain of his, four-man team that went on and won some championships. So, there are a ton of those opportunities. He did research at San Diego State after auditing upper division physics classes. So I think in many ways, homeschoolers have more opportunity because they're not sitting in a classroom for 8 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, right? They've got flexibility to form relationships. And then homeschoolers themselves, when they're applying to college,
Hmm.
they're often going to explain why they homeschooled, what does their homeschooling look like, what were the benefits, and what were the struggles? Because I've had homeschoolers who wrote about the fact that, they maybe struggled at first to kind of find their, gel in homeschooling. So, they try to be really honest, but that's going to come like on the Common App and the UC app. That's going to be an additional information or in any of the, essays. Could be the personal essay, could be a personal insight question. So homeschoolers themselves are going to explain, what did it look like? What opportunities? And remember, Tyler, that colleges, all students within their context, right? So,
Hmm.
whether it's this private high school, that public high school, that homeschool student, they're going to evaluate them on the opportunities that they talk about. So the more that, students can share about their experience, the more that parents can share, the more information colleges have. But, homeschooled students, they create their own opportunities too. They run businesses, they join community orchestras and community sports and things like that. It's a great path for the right, family and the right student. And I don't find colleges bat their eyes anymore about homeschoolers.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I mean, I also wanted to dig in a little bit on one thing that you kind of already talked about a little, like you referenced it earlier, which is letters of recommendation, right? You talked about how letters of recommendation can be a big part of your application because it's like one of the anchor points for like validation that these colleges can have. And also, on the other hand, most letters of recommendation for students that are in high schools come from teachers, counselors, coaches, or like club faculty advisors. So who do you get letters of recommendation from as a homeschooler, right? I mean, I don't think a letter from your parents is really what the college wants.
Right. So actually, so parents do write the counselor letter, although there are occasions where somebody else has been sort of overseeing the education, but the parent, can write. It is a counselor letter is subjective no matter who it is. But, community college teachers, online professors, tutors are great to write letters of recommendation. Any co-op teachers can write letters of recommendation. Anywhere a student has taken a class, that's where the letters of recommendation. So in the case, again, I'll use my older two as an example. So my eldest son had a professor at San Diego State write his physics recommendation. He worked with an online math tutor with upper division math concepts. He wrote his letter. And then he had an AP Lit teacher. She taught a group of homeschool students. And so he had
Mhm.
three outstanding teacher letters of recommendation. My middle son got a community college physics professor and a community college English professor to write his letters. And then they both had their music teachers write letters of recommendation, their bosses, they both worked. So they had letters of recommendation, non-academic from their bosses. So like
Mhm.
there are, I will admit, Tyler, for homeschool students who do a lot of online asynchronous learning, that letter of recommendation is harder to get. And it's why I always
Mhm.
encourage homeschool students, you've got to take some classes in person. You've got to, take some classes from people who will get to know you. So there have been a few occasions when it has been challenging because they've done most of their learning kind of, through like a college online that's asynchronous with not much interaction with the teacher. So it's something that I sort of require the students that I work with. I'm like, you have to take a class in person. You have to take a class with a professor that knows you. So, that on occasion is an issue, but most of my homeschool students, are well known and well liked by their teachers and tutors and professors, and they get great letters. Yeah, it's a good question though.
Yeah, great. Now, I think, is there anything just so far before we move on to kind of like what I want to cover next is basically the other side of it. Like if you're a student, maybe what colleges might be a fit for you, or how to evaluate that, or things like that. But before I move on to that part of it, is there anything that I haven't covered on that you think I should cover in this section?
Well, probably just, if your listeners are considering homeschooling, I think it is important to be a part of a group. So, like
Mhm.
parents, so I co moderate a Facebook group for California homeschool parents. And I think that's really important so that, parents shouldn't do this in isolation. I think it's really important to get student, support for yourself, support for your students. So, yeah, I would say that's probably before we move on is just make sure that you're in some sort of, community, whether it's a, in-person group, it's a Facebook group, a co-op, so that you're not going at this alone. And then, of course, you hire people like me who can help you navigate that.
Great. Yeah, well, let's then switch gears. I want to talk about colleges.
Yeah.
And basically, the short answer is if you're a homeschool student looking to apply to college, how do you know what to look for, I guess? Or I mean, that's kind of like I feel like so much of learning about what you like or don't like in a school has to do with your experience at a school beforehand, right? Like maybe you want a really big school. Oh, it turns out like that's too big. Maybe I want a smaller school for college, right? Things
True.
like that. So how do you help your clients figure out what schools they want to apply to?
Yeah. So in this case, I don't do anything too differently from, my non-homeschool students, right? We fill out a college inventory. We ask a lot of questions. We have, discussions over several hours. And then I encourage my students to visit, if nothing more, visit local schools of different kinds. So, right, visit that local small liberal arts college, visit that medium-sized, private research university, visit that large state school, preferably when students are in session so that you can get an idea of the differences among different types of colleges. Visit that Jesuit university if you're open to that, just to sort of broaden their exposure. Parents and students will travel sometimes on vacation, go visit colleges, pick a couple of colleges in the area to visit. So I think that's a great way to get exposure. If students are involved in, I've got a student who's a rower and that student travels, so the student's been able to visit different colleges when the student goes to tournaments, right? That's a great way. If a student is a musician or an athlete and they're traveling, that's what I'm encouraging them to do.
Hmm.
And actually, I wanted to jump just, it's kind of off topic, but we'll go back on topic. But I was just thinking one other thing when we talk about what kind of colleges are good for homeschoolers. There are some colleges that have onerous admissions requirements for homeschooling. So that's another thing that we talk about. For instance, New York
Right.
State has really sort of onerous requirements as far as like getting, your degree and, getting everything very accredited. So oftentimes my students outside of New York are not going to apply to New York public universities because it's very onerous because New York doesn't get the fact that different states have different regulations. So that is a
Right.
part of the conversation. Like when you're looking at colleges, some of it, like MIT doesn't even, like you cannot have a degree and go to MIT. Like you cannot graduate high school and go to MIT, right? That's how open
Hmm.
and friendly a school like that. Getting in is different with a 3% admit rate. But, those
Hmm.
are parts of the conversation as well. Which schools are really like, they love homeschoolers? MIT has been one historically that's loved homeschoolers.
Well, great. Yeah. And then I'd love to talk about like preparing your homeschooled students for success, both with the application process and with college. What are the things that you think are really important for you to kind of like, I don't want to say like get ahead of, but just like to be thinking about while you're, teaching your child in sort of ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th grade?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I touched on it before, but I think it's a really important one, particularly for students who are maybe a little bit more introverted. I do, like students who are maybe doing more of their learning online. I do encourage parents and students like you really do need to get out into the community. You do, because you're going to be going to a college campus. You're not going to be doing, now I have my youngest son does online college actually because it's super affordable. There were lots of reasons we chose to do that, but most students are not going to be doing that. So I think it's really important for them to get exposure, like to maybe to go away, do a summer program or take, your class at a college campus nearby, just because I think it's important for them to be able to interact with college professors. But I would say that for, students who aren't homeschooled, but particularly for students who do online education, I think it's really important for them to be exposed to like real situations with real college professors. And then as far as, preparing for the application process, again, we're going to check some boxes to make sure, like, do you have, have you met all the, 4 years of English, 4 years of math, 4 years of, science, at least, 2 to 3 years of foreign language, maybe four, depending on who you are, the history, 2 to 4 years of history. So we're tracking that to make sure that they are competitive for the colleges that they're looking into. So that's really important when I'm working with families. We have our spreadsheets and we have our
Hmm.
transcripts and we're really planning ahead. And then, as far as the college application process, as with most every other student, we're talking through the essay prompts, the personal essay, the personal insight questions, the supplemental essays. But we're also capitalizing in those essays on the homeschool experience and how that allowed them to, have their unique experiences and making
Hmm.
sure that you bring those into the essay so that colleges can see that you are well prepared. You've been out among, groups of diverse people, you are ready for success, you're academically prepared. So we really, I encourage my homeschool students to really strongly make that case that you are academically prepared, socially prepared, emotionally prepared. So those are the kinds of things that we talk about during the, the earlier high school years and then certainly during the high school application process, really showing, through your activities, through your essays, through your curriculum that you are definitely ready to succeed at the college level. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that actually was a great answer. Yeah, I think now what I'd love to do is kind of switch gears. You mentioned that you have had three children that you homeschooled, and all three of them have gone on to college. I mean, I don't know if you want to like give us the whole story or just the cliff notes or talk about like just things that you learned while doing that. But I'd love to just kind of learn more about your personal experience with this.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about it. I my kids know that I talk about them all the time because I use them as examples because they're very, very different. So I think that's why a lot of families actually come to me because all three of my kids have had radically different experiences. They're different people. So, I never set out to homeschool, but my eldest son was really academically advanced from early on. Like he was doing, division and multiplication and square roots at age 4. Like, okay, what do you do with that? And he also was really energetic. So I used to be a
Hmm.
public school teacher. I was a special ed teacher, and I knew he wasn't going to fit into a system. So we just started homeschooling him early. And he is just someone that learns like just, like the air you breathe in. So for him, homeschooling was
Hmm.
really joyful. And we never set out for him to apply to selective schools. That really, my background is pretty humble. My husband didn't finish college. I went to San Diego State, got a couple of teaching credentials. So, selective colleges were never a part of our lives, but it became apparent that because he just kept pushing the bounds of learning and he loved just being involved in, he was a musician, he was a chess player, he was a baseball player, he was involved in church. I mean, he just was like, just so out there. And so, during high school, we just kept letting him pursue the things that he loved and took, the things that maybe he didn't like so much. And
Hmm.
then by the time, he was approaching the college application process, it was clear that, because I kind of had a heart, we're a Christian family, and I was like, oh, I'd love for him to go to a Christian university, but like it was clear that that's not where he, was meant to be. So he ended up applying to, selective schools, and he was fortunate to get into all of them. So we practice something called self-directed learning. So I really, with all my kids, I really let them choose their path. Like he loved, like I said, math and physics. So by the time he was done with high school, he had taken, like 8 college, 8 math, 8 physics, 8 math college courses each, because
Wow.
that's what he loved to do. Yeah, so, that was him. So that was him, and that was, just an easy path. And then my middle son, again, very motivated, but he also had a lot of health issues and disabilities. So he was diagnosed with type 1
Hmm.
diabetes at 10. He had a vision disability, a hearing loss, some learning disabilities. So homeschooling was actually really good so that we could help manage his health. And to be honest, we weren't sure that he was going to go to college just because of all the health issues. But then he started at community college in 11th grade, and he just was really successful. He did really, really well. And so he, again, and he was a musician, a really, really, really talented cellist. So I think his talent was also part of his way into college, but he's had a meandering path. So he went off to school. He went to the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League school, but he came home 10 weeks later, due to a number of reasons. And so he's actually at his third college. So because of his health issues, so he went to Penn, came home, went to Cal State Fullerton, came home, and now he's at San Diego State and still working toward a degree because he was in the hospital a couple months last year. And so I work with a lot of parents who have both, I guess, gifted children, but also children with, like health challenges as well. So you can still navigate it. There is still a way forward. And then my youngest son, he threw everything out because he just wasn't that excited about learning. But
Hmm.
in high school, we found just the most tremendous tutor, English tutor, teacher for him. So he was involved in a local co-op where he took classes and stuff like that. But his English tutor, she was my eldest son's English teacher way like 10 years before that, and I reconnected with her, and she turned him around, and he's an English major, and he's doing great in college. He goes to Regent University, which is a Christian school. So each of my kids has had a very different path. I think homeschooling was beneficial, like for my eldest son, because it let him fly academically. For my middle son, because
Hmm.
it let us manage his health issues while allowing him to still become, just this conservatory level musician and taking college classes. And then for my youngest son, because we were able to really kind of help him develop into someone who became a really strong writer. So I think
Hmm.
homeschooling can be beneficial for multiple types of students. So I love to use my example of, they don't all have to look the same to be successful,
Hmm.
at homeschooling. So yeah, that's a snippet.
Yeah, that's great. Well, yeah, I really, like you said, it's just like there are so many different types of students, and certainly there's so many different types of homeschool students.
Yeah, for sure.
And yeah, I guess, is there anything that we haven't covered today that you want to make sure that we cover?
Yeah, I guess that's kind of the way I end all my homeschool podcasts. It's like if you want to do it, if you want to homeschool, parents, you can do it. Like I said, it's important that you get support. It's important that you kind of dispel myths of, what you think homeschooling looks like and whether, the scared factor or the fact that colleges don't admit homeschoolers, like that's just not true. So yeah, I would encourage, anybody considering homeschooling, anybody who, may have homeschooled, but then they're scared to homeschool high school, get
Hmm.
get with groups, find other people who have done it, reach out to, consultants who, work with high schoolers because it's not for everyone, it's not for everyone. And I have students who come in homeschooling and leave homeschooling, come back. I have students who start a homeschooling and then they go to, public school or private school. That's the beauty about higher education is that we have the choices. So I would say I'm someone who likes to empower parents to, and students to make the decision
Hmm.
that's best for your child. If that's homeschooling,
Hmm.
great. Let's find a way for you to do it.
Right. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. This has
You're
been
welcome.
Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Rebecca Stuart-Orlowski from Orlowski College Consulting. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT and CLT courses by going to achievable.me.